The letter came on a Tuesday. It was crisp, official, and it told me my father was dead. A hunting accident, they called it. Slipped on some wet leaves, fell into a ravine. A tragedy, but a simple one. The kind of thing that happens in a town like Blackwood Creek, a place so deep in the mountains the trees have more say than the people. I hadn't spoken to my father in 10 years, not since the day I packed a single bag and left that town in my rearview mirror, vowing never to return. He was the sheriff, a hard man, carved from the same stone as the mountains around him. We never saw eye to eye. To me, he was the town, and the town was a cage. But he was still my father. So I went back. The drive felt like going backward in time. Paved roads turned to gravel, cell service vanished, and the trees closed in, a suffocating green canopy that blocked out the sun. Blackwood Creek looked exactly the same. The same general store, the same weathered church, the same faces staring from porches, eyes full of secrets I'd tried to forget. Sheriff Elias Thorne met me at my father's house. He'd been my dad's deputy, a man I'd known my whole life. He had a tired look in his eyes, the kind of weariness that comes from seeing too much. "Caleb," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm sorry about your father. He was a good man." I just nodded. The house smelled of stale coffee and pine-scented cleaner. It was too quiet. My father had been a man of noise and presence. This silence was a wound. Elias handed me a box of his personal effects, his wallet, his keys, his badge. And at the bottom, a small hand-carved wooden bird. It was crudely made, whittled from a piece of dark wood, its wings half spread. "We found this in his hand," Elias said. "Must have been a project of his." But I knew what it was. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just a random carving. It was a symbol, a warden's mark. Something my father had told me about, years ago, in a hushed voice late at night. A secret he'd forbidden me to ever speak of. He hadn't slipped. He hadn't fallen. Someone had pushed him. I held the wooden bird in my palm, its sharp edges digging into my skin. The official story was a lie. I knew it, deep in my bones. A hunting accident. It was clean, it was simple, and it was the kind of story that a town like Blackwood Creek was very, very good at telling. Elias was watching me, his gaze heavy. "You should get some rest, son. We'll handle the arrangements." I didn't answer. I just stared at the bird, the warden's mark. It was a message, a warning. My father had been one of the wardens, a secret group of town elders who supposedly protected Blackwood Creek from, well, he'd never told me from what. He'd only said their duty was older than the town itself. And this mark, in his hand, could only mean one thing. He hadn't just been killed. He'd been judged. I spent that night in my childhood bed, the unfamiliar familiarity of the room pressing in on me. Sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the old house sounded like a footstep. Every shadow looked like a figure standing in the corner. I kept thinking about that bird. The next morning, I drove out to the ravine where he died. The local police had marked it off with yellow tape, a flimsy barrier against the vast, indifferent wilderness. The spot was just off a well-worn game trail. Plausible enough for a slip and fall. But my father knew these woods better than his own home. He'd taught me how to track, how to read the signs the forest leaves behind. He wouldn't have been careless. I ducked under the tape and made my way down the steep incline. It was a mess of loose rock and damp earth. At the bottom, a small, dark stain marked the spot where he'd landed. I crouched down, running my fingers through the dirt. And that's when I found it. It wasn't much. Just a single dark thread snagged on the root of a tree, almost invisible against the soil. It was thick, coarse, the kind of thread used for weaving heavy cloaks, the kind of cloaks the wardens wore during their secret meetings in the woods. I pocketed the thread and climbed back up. As I reached the top, I saw a figure standing by my truck. It was old Martha, who ran the town diner. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes sharp and knowing. "You shouldn't be here, Caleb," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The woods have taken enough." "My father didn't fall, Martha." She looked away, towards the deep shadows of the forest. "Some things are best left buried. Your father understood that. It's why he did what he did." Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and shuffled back toward the road, disappearing into the trees like a ghost. My father did what he did. What did that mean? I drove back to town with 100 questions burning in my mind. I went to the sheriff's office. Elias was at his desk, buried in paperwork. He looked up as I walked in, his expression unreadable. "Find what you were looking for?" he asked. I placed the wooden bird and the coarse thread on his desk. "I think you know what these are. I think you know my father was murdered." Elias leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving mine. He sighed, a long, heavy sound that seemed to carry the weight of the whole town. "Your father was a complicated man, Caleb," he said slowly. "He made choices, hard ones. He believed he was protecting this town. Protecting it from what?" He didn't answer. He just picked up the wooden bird. "This is a warden's mark, yes. It means a judgment was passed, but you've got it all wrong. Your father wasn't the one being judged." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "He was the one passing judgment on himself." The air left my lungs. My father took his own life? It made no sense. He was a fighter. He was the sheriff. He was the man who taught me to never, ever give up. "I don't believe you," I said, my voice shaking. "The wardens have a code," Elias continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "A sacrifice to keep the balance, a promise made to the woods a long, long time ago. Your father knew the time was coming. He knew a life was owed." "What promise? What sacrifice?" "It's not my place to say," Elias said, standing up. He walked to the window, staring out at the quiet street. "He chose to pay the debt himself, to spare someone else. He saw it as his final duty as sheriff, as a warden. We honored his wish. We called it an accident to protect his memory, to protect the town." It was a neat little story. It explained everything. The warden's mark, the secrecy, the strange warnings. It painted my father as a hero, a martyr for his community. But it felt wrong. It was too easy, too clean. My father was a hard man, a stubborn man. But he wasn't a man who would throw his life away for some ancient, unspoken promise. There was something else going on, something Elias was hiding. I left the station, his words echoing in my head. A sacrifice to keep the balance. It sounded like something out of a folk tale. I walked through the town, but now I saw it differently. The quiet smiles of the townsfolk seemed like masks. The peaceful facade seemed thin, brittle, like it could shatter at any moment. I needed to find proof. Something that would cut through the lies. I went back to my father's house and started tearing it apart. I searched his office, his bedroom, the dusty attic. I found old case files, photo albums, hunting trophies, but nothing that pointed to a conspiracy. Finally, in the back of his closet, tucked away in an old boot, I found a small leather-bound journal. His handwriting filled the pages. It wasn't a diary. It was a ledger. Dates, names, and numbers. And notes, written in a cramped, hurried script. I flipped through the pages, my heart pounding. Much of it was mundane town business. But then I found a section at the back. It was titled, "The Tithe." My blood turned to ice. The entries were cryptic. "The 20-year cycle nears its end. The grove is prepared. Elias pushes for the old way." And then, the last entry, dated the day before he died. "They've chosen the girl. Lily. I cannot let this happen. There has to be another way. I will not be the one to lead her to the slaughter. Lily." Lily Armitage, my childhood friend. The girl I'd left behind when I'd fled Blackwood Creek. The tithe wasn't a metaphor. The sacrifice wasn't my father. It was her. And the wardens weren't protecting the town. They were feeding it to something. I slammed the journal shut, my mind racing. Elias hadn't just lied to me. He was part of it. He was pushing for the old way. He was planning to sacrifice Lily. My father had found out. He'd tried to stop them, and they had killed him for it. I had to find her. I ran out of the house and jumped in my truck, kicking up a spray of gravel as I peeled out of the driveway. Lily's family lived in a small farmhouse on the edge of town, surrounded by fields of corn. As I sped down the familiar country road, a dark shape suddenly darted out in front of me. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt just inches from a massive deer standing frozen in the headlights. And then, from the woods on either side of the road, figures emerged. They were wearing the dark, heavy cloaks I'd found the thread from. Their faces were hidden in the shadows of their hoods. There were 4 of them. They moved silently, surrounding my truck. One of them stepped forward and raised a hand. It was Sheriff Elias Thorne. "You should have listened, Caleb," he said, his voice calm, but with an edge of steel. "You should have left it alone." I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. There was no way out. The road was blocked, and the woods were full of them. "Where is she, Elias? Where's Lily?" He didn't answer. One of the other figures stepped forward and pulled back his hood. It was Mr. Henderson, the man who owned the general store. Then another revealed himself, the town priest. The last one was a woman I didn't recognize, her face hard and unforgiving. The wardens, the pillars of the community. "The tithe must be paid," the priest said, his voice ringing with a fanatic's certainty. "It is the price of our peace, the price of our prosperity. Your father understood this. He was just too weak to see it through." "He wasn't weak," I shot back. "He was trying to stop you monsters." Elias shook his head slowly. "He wasn't trying to stop it. He was trying to change it. He wanted to offer himself in the girl's place. A noble gesture, but a foolish one. The promise wasn't for a warden. It was for a child of the town, the old blood." They started closing in, their movements slow, deliberate, like predators cornering their prey. I had one chance. I slammed the truck into reverse, spun the wheel, and floored it. The tires screamed as I swung the truck around, aiming back the way I came. They were faster than I expected. One of them lunged, and I felt a heavy thud against the side of the truck. I didn't look back. I just drove, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had to get away. I had to find Lily before they did. I didn't go back to my father's house. They'd be watching it. Instead, I drove deep into the national forest that bordered the town, finally pulling over on a deserted logging road. I killed the engine and sat in the darkness, the silence of the woods pressing in on me. I had to think. They had Lily, or they were about to. The journal said the grove was prepared. I remembered my father taking me to an old sacred grove deep in the woods when I was a boy. A circle of ancient moss-covered stones. He'd called it the heart of the forest. If they were going to perform some kind of ritual, it would be there. I had to go there. But I couldn't go in blind. I needed a weapon. I needed a plan. I remembered my father kept a spare hunting rifle locked in a case under the back seat of his old truck, which was still parked in the garage back at the house. I had to risk it. I circled back on foot, sticking to the shadows, my senses on high alert. The town was quiet, but it was a menacing quiet. A predator holding its breath. I slipped into the garage and found the truck. The rifle case was still there. Inside, I found the rifle, a box of shells, and something else. A small, tarnished silver key taped to the stock. I didn't recognize it. But my father didn't do things without a reason. I pocketed the key and the rifle and slipped back into the night. The hike to the grove was long and grueling. I moved without a flashlight, using the faint moonlight that filtered through the trees, relying on memories from 20 years ago. The woods felt different at night, alive, watching. As I got closer, I heard voices, low, chanting. I crept forward, my rifle held at the ready. Through a break in the trees, I saw it. The stone circle, torches cast flickering, dancing shadows. The 4 wardens stood in the center, their faces grim. And there, tied between 2 of the largest stones, was Lily. She was terrified, her eyes wide, but she was defiant. She wasn't screaming or crying. She was staring them down. Elias was holding a long, ceremonial-looking knife. He began to speak in a strange, guttural language I didn't understand. The ritual had begun. I couldn't just charge in. There were 4 of them, and they were expecting trouble. I needed a distraction. I looked around, my eyes scanning the darkness. And then I saw it. A pile of dry leaves and brush, just upwind from the grove. It was a long shot. But it was the only shot I had. I crawled to the brush pile, pulled out the lighter from my pocket, and set it ablaze. The dry tinder caught instantly, and flames roared to life, smoke billowing into the night sky, carried by the wind directly into the grove. Chaos erupted. The wardens coughed and stumbled, their chanting broken. The smoke was thick, blinding. This was my chance. I burst from the trees, rifle raised. "Let her go, Elias!" I yelled, my voice raw. He spun around, his eyes wild with fury. "You!" he snarled. "You can't stop this! It's destiny!" I fired a warning shot into the air. The crack of the rifle echoed through the trees. Henderson and the priest scattered, running for cover. The unknown woman, however, drew a pistol from beneath her cloak and fired at me. I dove behind one of the ancient stones as the bullet whizzed past my head, chipping off a piece of rock. This wasn't a ritual. This was an execution. And these were not just town elders. They were killers. Elias used the confusion to his advantage. He lunged toward Lily, the knife raised high. He wasn't chanting anymore. He was just a man in a hurry. I had a clear shot, but Lily was right behind him. If I missed, I could hit her. I held my breath, lined up the sights, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against my shoulder. The bullet hit Elias in the arm, the one holding the knife. He cried out in pain, stumbling back, the blade clattering against the stone floor. The woman fired at me again, and I ducked. I had to end this. Now. I scrambled from behind the stone, charging forward. I tackled Elias, sending us both sprawling to the ground. We wrestled for a moment, a desperate struggle in the dirt and smoke. He was strong, fueled by a fanatic's rage. But I was younger, and I was fighting for a life. I landed a punch on his jaw, and he went limp. The woman was reloading her pistol. I didn't have time to get my rifle. I grabbed the ceremonial knife from the ground and ran towards her. She looked up, her eyes wide with shock, just as I closed the distance. I disarmed her, the pistol flying into the darkness. She backed away, her face a mask of hate, and then turned and fled into the woods. Henderson and the priest were already gone. The grove was silent, except for the crackling of the fire and Lily's ragged breaths. I rushed to her side and cut her free. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought I was going to die." "I know," I said, helping her to her feet. "I know. Let's get out of here." We ran. We didn't look back. We plunged into the dark forest, away from the stone circle, away from the dying fire and the unconscious sheriff. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out. We finally collapsed at the edge of a stream, gasping for air. "What was that?" Lily finally asked, her voice shaking. "The tithe. They kept talking about the tithe. I told her everything, about my father, the journal, the wardens, about the lie they'd built to hide their monstrous tradition." She listened, her expression turning from fear to a slow, burning anger. "For generations?" she said, her voice filled with disbelief. "They've been doing this for generations?" "It seems so," I said grimly. "A life every 20 years, for peace and prosperity." But something still didn't add up. Blackwood Creek wasn't prosperous. It was a dying town. The logging industry had collapsed years ago. The farms were barely breaking even. What prosperity were they paying for? The whole thing felt hollow. The motive was missing. We made our way back to my truck, which was still hidden on the logging road. As we drove away, leaving Blackwood Creek behind for the second time in my life, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only scratched the surface. We'd stopped the sacrifice, but we hadn't uncovered the truth, not by a long shot. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached the next state. We found a small, anonymous motel off the highway. Only then did I feel like I could finally breathe. As Lily slept, exhausted from the ordeal, I sat by the window, the rifle on the table next to me. I thought about Elias's words. The price of our prosperity. It was a lie. There was no prosperity. So what was the real price? What were they really buying with these sacrifices? My mind went back to my father's journal. The ledger. Dates, names, numbers. It had seemed like town business. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was something else entirely. And then there was the key. The small, tarnished silver key I'd found with the rifle. I took it out of my pocket. It was old, ornate. On one side, there was a small engraving. It wasn't a bird. It was a serpent, eating its own tail. I had no idea what it meant. I needed to go back. It was a crazy idea. I'd just escaped with my life. But the truth was still buried back there, and I couldn't let it go. My father had died for this secret. I owed it to him, and to Lily, to expose it. When Lily woke up, I told her my plan. "You're insane," she said, her eyes wide. "They'll kill you, Caleb." "They won't be expecting me to come back," I argued. "Not this soon. I need to get back into my father's office. There's something there. I know it." I convinced her to stay put, to call the state police if she didn't hear from me in 24 hours. She didn't like it, but she agreed. The drive back to Blackwood Creek was the longest of my life. Every car that passed felt like a threat. Every shadow on the road looked like a warden. I parked miles outside of town and went in on foot, moving through the woods under the cover of darkness. The town was on edge. I could feel it. Lights were on in houses that were usually dark. I saw people patrolling the streets, not in uniform, but in hunting gear, carrying rifles. They were looking for us. The sheriff's office was at the back of the town hall. I circled around, found a window in the records room and pried it open. I slipped inside, moving like a ghost through the silent building. My father's office was just as I'd left it. I closed the door and turned on his desk lamp, keeping the beam low. Where would he hide something? He was a man of habit, a man of procedure, but he was also a man of secrets. I searched his desk, the filing cabinets, the bookshelves. Nothing. It was all official business. Arrest reports, town budgets, patrol schedules. Then my eyes landed on the large, framed map of the county that hung on his wall. It was old, yellowed with age. My father had always been proud of it. He'd updated it by hand over the years, marking new roads and property lines. I ran my hand over the surface. Behind the frame, near the bottom, I felt a slight ridge. I took the map off the wall. Taped to the back was a flat metal box, a safe box. It had a small, tarnished silver lock. My heart pounded. I took out the key. The serpent. It slid into the lock perfectly. I turned it and the box clicked open. Inside, there was another journal. But this one was different. The leather was new, the handwriting was the same, but the words told a story that was 1,000 times worse than a pagan sacrifice. The tithe wasn't for some ancient forest god. The first page had a list of names, going back over 100 years. Next to each name was a date and a number, a very large number. It was a payment ledger. The sacrifice wasn't a sacrifice at all. It was a transaction. Every 20 years, the wardens of Blackwood Creek didn't kill one of their own. They sold them. The journal laid it all out in my father's cold, methodical script. The town's founders had made a deal with a shadowy organization, a human trafficking ring with deep roots. In exchange for a massive, untraceable payment that kept the town's key families wealthy, the wardens would provide one person. Someone young, with no close family to ask questions. Someone who would simply disappear. The story about the forest god, the tithe, the ritual. It was all a lie. A terrifyingly effective piece of folklore created to control the town, to justify the unjustifiable, to ensure no one ever looked too closely when someone went missing. My father hadn't been trying to stop it. He'd been running it. For years. The journal detailed his meetings, the drop-offs, the payments. He'd inherited the role of warden from his father, just as Elias had from his. It was a legacy of evil. But then, in the last few entries, the tone changed. It became angry, paranoid. "The buyers are changing the terms," he wrote. "They want more. They're getting greedy. Elias and the others are too scared to stand up to them. They'll ruin everything." My father wasn't having a crisis of conscience. He wasn't trying to save Lily. He was in a business dispute. He'd been trying to renegotiate the deal. Maybe find a new buyer. He saw the trafficking ring as a necessary evil, the source of his family's and the town's secret wealth. But he was losing control. The final entry made it clear. "Elias made his move. He thinks I'm a liability. He's convinced the others I've gone soft. They're going to remove me. They plan to use the old ritual as a cover story for the town and hand Lily over to seal their new arrangement with the buyers. They think they can just take over. They have no idea what I've set in motion." My father knew they were coming for him. He'd been preparing for it. He hadn't been murdered because he was a hero. He'd been murdered as part of a corporate takeover, a hostile, bloody coup in a century-old criminal enterprise. I felt sick. My entire life, my entire understanding of my father, was a lie. He wasn't a hard but fair sheriff. He was a monster, a human trafficker, and Elias Thorne was just the new CEO. Suddenly, I heard a noise in the hallway. Footsteps. I switched off the lamp, plunging the office into darkness. I grabbed the journal and the safe box and flattened myself against the wall behind the door. My heart was a drum against my ribs. The doorknob turned slowly. The door creaked open. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. It was Elias. His arm was in a sling, but in his other hand, he held a gun. He stepped into the room, and I knew this was it. He hadn't come to arrest me. He'd come to finish the job his wardens had started. He flicked on the lights. The room was empty. I was gone. He swore under his breath and turned to leave. And that's when I brought the heavy safe box down on the back of his head. He crumpled to the floor without a sound. I didn't wait to see if he was breathing. I took his gun and I ran. I had the truth. I had the ledger. But it was just my word against an entire town built on a foundation of lies. The local authorities were compromised. The wardens were the pillars of the community. Who would believe me? I had to get this journal to someone outside their sphere of influence. Someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. As I fled the town hall, alarms started to blare. Elias must have had a partner waiting outside. The whole town would be hunting me now. I ran for the woods, the only place I could hide. As I reached the tree line, I saw them. Headlights. Not one or two cars, but a convoy. Dark SUVs, rumbling up the single road into Blackwood Creek. They weren't police cars. They were the buyers. They were coming to collect their property. Coming to seal their new deal with Elias. The whole town was about to become a war zone. And I was trapped right in the middle of it. I retreated deeper into the forest, my mind racing. The buyers arriving was bad, but it was also an opportunity. They were the evidence I needed. If I could expose them, along with the wardens, the whole rotten structure would come crashing down. But how? I was one man, with a rifle and a journal, against two separate criminal organizations. My father's last journal entry echoed in my head. They have no idea what I've set in motion. What had he set in motion? It sounded like a threat. A dead man's switch. He knew they were coming for him. He wouldn't have gone down without a backup plan. A final, vengeful move from beyond the grave. I had to figure out what it was. I found a place to hide, a small cave I remembered from my childhood, and I examined the journal and the safe box again. There had to be another clue. And then I found it. Not in the journal, but scratched into the metal on the inside of the safe box lid, almost invisible. It was a string of numbers. Not a date, not a code. It looked like a frequency, a radio frequency. And below it, a single word. Sundown. My father had a powerful ham radio in the basement of his house. He'd called it a hobby, something to tinker with. But what if it was more? What if it was his emergency line? Sundown. That was tonight. I didn't know what would happen when the sun went down, but my father had set an appointment. I had to be there to keep it. This meant going back into the heart of the town, into my father's house, which was undoubtedly being watched by both the wardens and the buyers. It was a suicide mission, but it was the only move I had left. The town was crawling with armed men. Some were locals I recognized, members of the warden's little militia. Others were strangers, professionals, dressed in tactical gear, moving with a cold efficiency. The buyer's private army. They weren't fighting each other. Not yet. They were working together, securing the town, looking for me. I used the cover of the woods to circle around to the back of my father's property. The house was lit up. I could see men inside, searching. I had to wait. Hours passed. The sun began to dip below the mountain peaks. Sundown. I watched as the search teams pulled out of the house, moving on to the next one. They left 2 men on guard, one at the front door, one at the back. I had to create a diversion. I found a propane tank for a barbecue grill in a neighbor's shed. I quietly rolled it down the hill on the far side of the street, then opened the valve. I waited a few moments, then aimed my rifle. The shot was deafening in the quiet evening. The tank exploded in a massive fireball, sending a shockwave through the neighborhood. The 2 guards at my father's house immediately ran toward the explosion, shouting into their radios. That was my window. I sprinted across the yard, forced the back door, and slipped into the house. I went straight to the basement. The radio was in the corner, a massive, complex piece of equipment. It was already humming, powered on. A timer. My father had set it all up before he died. I looked at the frequency scratched into the box. I carefully dialed it in. The radio hissed with static. I waited. Nothing. Had I gotten it wrong? Was it a trap? Then, a voice crackled through the speaker. It was distorted, digitized, but clear. Watcher 1, this is Sundown. Do you copy? Watcher 1, my father. I grabbed the microphone, my hand shaking. This is Watcher 1's son, I stammered. He's gone. There was a long silence on the other end. I thought I'd lost them. We feared as much, the voice finally said. He missed the last 2 check-ins. We have a protocol for this. Is the package secure? The package, the journal, the ledger. Yes, I said. I have it. Good. A contingency has been activated. Help is on the way. I need you to confirm your father's final authentication code. It's the name of his first dog. I froze. I had no idea. He'd had a dog when I was very young, but I couldn't remember its name for the life of me. My mind went blank with panic. Then I remembered. The wooden bird. The warden's mark. It wasn't just a symbol. It was a carving. A specific kind of bird. Sparrow, I said into the microphone. The dog's name was Sparrow. Another pause. Then, authentication confirmed. Sit tight, son. We're already here. Suddenly the house shook. The sound of helicopters roared overhead. Not one, but several. Shouts and gunfire erupted outside. The buyers and the wardens were being engaged. I didn't know who Sundown was. Federal agents? A rival organization? It didn't matter. They were tearing the town apart. I stayed in the basement, listening to the battle rage outside. It was short, brutal, and decisive. The professionals from the outside were no match for whoever was descending on Blackwood Creek. After about 20 minutes, the gunfire stopped. There was a pounding on the basement door. "This is the FBI!" a voice shouted. "Come out with your hands up!" I opened the door to find a dozen heavily armed agents in tactical gear. They swarmed the basement, their weapons trained on me. My father wasn't working with a rival criminal ring. He'd been an informant. The agent in charge, a man with a grim, determined face, lowered his weapon. "You're Caleb?" he asked. I nodded. "Your father was working with us for the last 6 months," he explained. He was building a case against the entire network, the traffickers, the buyers, and his own people here in town. He knew they were going to kill him. The radio check-in was his dead man's switch. If he missed it, we were to assume the worst and move in. He looked at the journal in my hands. I believe that's the final piece of the puzzle. His ledger. It all clicked into place. My father hadn't been a hero trying to stop a sacrifice, and he hadn't been just a monster fighting for a bigger piece of the pie. The truth was something far more complicated. He had been a monster, yes. For decades, he'd been an integral part of this horrific machine, but somewhere along the way, something had changed. Maybe it was the buyers getting too greedy. Maybe it was the thought of sacrificing Lily, a girl he'd watched grow up. Or maybe, just maybe, after a lifetime of evil, he wanted to do one thing right. He couldn't just walk away. They would have killed him. He couldn't just confess. He'd spend the rest of his life in prison. So he chose a third option. He decided to burn the whole world down and take everyone with him. He used his intimate knowledge of the operation to feed information to the FBI, setting up a sting that would only trigger after his own death. He had orchestrated his own murder to be the catalyst for justice, a final, terrible act of vengeance, and, perhaps, of redemption. The FBI took my statement. The ledger in the journal was the key, corroborating all the information my father had provided. It gave them names, dates, and bank accounts that connected the Blackwood Creek wardens to a global trafficking network. Elias Thorne, what was left of the wardens, and the buyer's entire team were all arrested. The town's dark secret was finally dragged out into the light, a grotesque truth that had festered for over a century. The story of the tithe, of the forest god, was exposed for the sick fairy tale it was. Blackwood Creek would never be the same. The town was broken, its foundation of lies shattered. Some people refused to believe it. Others packed their bags and left, unable to live in the shadow of such a horrifying legacy. I didn't stay for the aftermath. I found Lily, made sure she was safe and had people to look after her. We said our goodbyes, a shared look in our eyes that acknowledged the nightmare we had survived. Then I got in my truck and drove away. I still don't know what to make of my father. Was he a good man who did terrible things, or a bad man who did one good thing in the end? I don't think I'll ever have an answer. People are complicated. Their motives are messy. Sometimes the only thing you can do is look at the results. He built a cage of lies and secrets, but in the end, he also gave me the key. He led them all to the slaughter, and he used his own death as the bait. A final, perfect act of a sheriff, a warden, and a monster. The road out of Blackwood Creek felt different this time. The trees no longer felt like they were closing in. The silence was no longer menacing. It was just quiet. The quiet of an old story that has finally, blessedly, come to an end. If you were captivated by this story of secrets and justice, Make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You never know what other dark tales are waiting to be uncovered.